Commission. I'm Councilwoman Annie Bench, and today we're here to talk about the Historic District Commission in Saginaw. And I'm just going to have us introduce ourselves real quick, and then we can get right into the conversation. So I'll turn it over to Cece.
I am Cecilia Olvera. I am a Saginaw homeowner.
Hi, I'm Kevin Hayes, and I'm a lifelong resident of the city of Saginaw and a student at Michigan State University.
And then I'm Alex Mixter. I am the chair of the Historic District Commission, and I grew up in Saginaw and live in the Cathedral District.
Great. And you're also our Historic District Commission chair. And I'd just like you to tell us a little bit about yourself as far as I think you're a documentary maker and just some of your experiences here in Saginaw since you moved home that led you to end up serving on the Historic District Commission.
Yeah, so growing up, I think that it was already in my blood because my dad's a bit of a historian as well, and he does all kinds of history related to shipwrecks and like the maritime world and things like that. And in the last couple of years, I've completely fallen in love with everything that I jokingly say is above ground and not underwater, which is essentially all the historic assets we have throughout the city, and that actually can go beyond just the individual buildings as well, which is a whole piece I'm sure we'll jump into more soon. But I grew up in Saginaw Township, actually, and I adopted the city of Saginaw because I ran away screaming when I was 19 and I went to Chicago and didn't want to really be around Saginaw at all. And then the further I got away, I ended up going out to Denver as well. And the further I got away, the more I realized that I missed home, and I wanted to try to capture that through a way that I knew how, through doing video work and things like that. And so I wanted to make a documentary, and I came home to concentrate pretty much explicitly on the good things happening. I wanted to kind of counter the reasons that I left, which was just a very, very strong negative narrative. And I wanted to just exclusively look for the good things. And one of those good things that came up was that there was a bunch of people that cared about an old house that was on Washington, and that it was actually slated for demolition. And there were a bunch of people who banded around to say, we ought to do something about this. That ultimately led to my involvement, which I'm currently the project manager on the redevelopment of that building. So I got very involved with those efforts to prevent the demolition. But at the same time, as a cleanup, we lost two really cool buildings in downtown Saginaw that it was the weekend that we were doing a cleanup on the exterior of the house. We had two buildings come down. And from there, I got very captivated by the idea of how do we lose a building, and how do you essentially prevent a demolition from happening. And it was kind of a no-brainer to get involved on the Historic District Commission because it's a very real way to be involved in that kind of work, because it's an official capacity of the city of Saginaw in which you can look out for the things that we have. And so I joined the commission back in 2018, and then over time became the vice chair and then became the chair. And it's been one of my favorite things to be a part of. And there's a ton to it.
Thank you. Do you want to tell us a little bit about Saginaw, the organization? Do you want to talk about that a little bit, which is named after your documentary?
So the documentary evolved a lot. I'm always asked where we can watch it, and I have to inform people that the moment I finished the documentary, I wanted to pull everything back and essentially not do so much talking and do a lot more listening, and to get into the trenches a lot more. And what that eventually evolved into is the idea that what we have, in fact, there was a lot of people I talked to, and the theme of the documentary is essentially you can't wait around for someone to come and fix things. You gotta grab a rake, go to the park, and help pick up trash. We have limited resources around here. There's not a lot of capacity to do a lot of the things that we used to be able to do, but in the context of historic preservation, there was an era in which money was no object at all. And we created a lot of really incredible buildings, and we had architects who were coming up from places like Chicago and Detroit, who were doing things in Saginaw. And there were a lot of local architects that had some really incredible visionary ideas. In fact, this is a whole other tangent, but one of the architects had a vision for the city of Saginaw back in the 1860s when it was a swamp, to become the Venice of America and to use a canal system where we would have actually, if his ideas came to fruition, we would have been known as the Venice of America. And, you know, appropriate because in Detroit they called that the Paris of the Midwest, or was it the West? I forget exactly which one, but I know it was Paris. But we had all of these brilliant minds, and we still do. It's just that the amount of money and resources, the resources they were using at the time no longer exist. So really, in making a documentary, it's a good way to highlight things and to dive into things and to say, here's something that matters. What I learned from doing the film was that I wanted to do a lot more than talk about it. I wanted to figure out what the actual solutions were. It's one thing to point a finger and say, hey, this is the problem, but I really found it to be a completely different conversation entirely, to actually figure out what the mechanics are of these types of problems. So Saginaw evolved from a documentary that's looking for the good things and really trying to make the best of what we have, where the film is now the thesis statement. And the work is essentially looking after the things that we have and what the good stewardship looks like. And at the Lee, when we did certain things, we noticed the results of certain actions had more effect than others. And a huge example is the removal of the more blighted elements, the removal of plywood, the repair of windows. To put a roof on a building does wonders for the building, prevents tens and if not hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of damage. There were so many things that I was seeing the resources going into different areas, particularly demolition. And we came up with the option essentially to be good stewards for these types of things instead of just saying, I wish we could do something about that. But it's essentially the bet on the positive to say we're going to put our money into the things that will improve the situation directly now, and to organize volunteers into that capacity, and trying to close the huge gap we have in skilled trades currently. There's a lot of things to this that go beyond just cool buildings. It really starts to evolve into a bigger picture. And that's where we come in essentially, is to try to connect all those dots and to say, like what we have in public ownership are the things that we need, the things that we ought to be using, and the things we should be making the best of. And more often than not, they're very historic.
Thanks, Alex. I would just add too that the Lee was in public ownership. It was owned by the city of Saginaw at the time I joined council, and at least I'm sure there were votes to demolish it too along the way, no doubt. But I know at least 2 votes were taken to save it from demolition, and the idea was just to, what if we spent that money that we were going to use on demolition and into fixing it up, and we had such community support around it. It was something that the city was actually able to, do, which I think they thought was very risky at the time, but it's it's the perfect example of how you can take something that is in public ownership and create a vision around it and do something about it. And I think that's fantastic, and I think that's what we're aspiring to do with some of our other precious few buildings that we have left. If there's nothing else that you want to add, Alex, I'll jump right into the questions.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay, good. All right, well, the first question is, what is the Historic District Commission and why is it so important to the Saginaw community?
So this is one of the questions that I think a lot of people get mixed up on because of the fact that a historic designation can go a number of ways, and what it means can mean a number of things. But essentially, what the HDC is really assigned to do is to identify and also create essentially like a degree of like a local protection. If any changes are occurring on a building, if it's any exterior changes at all, we don't have any purview over the interiors. But the exterior of the building, what we're trying to do is just kind of maintain the streetscape and the historic nature of a neighborhood or an individual building. There are a lot of things that people do that they think is modernizing a building, and if anything, it's actually to the detriment of the building. And there are a lot of things that people don't necessarily realize about what the changes to, something as small as the windows can do to the overall view of the structure. So we essentially are tasked with, and we don't have all of our historic assets currently under local protection. That's actually a process that we have really picked up in the time I've been chair, in trying to identify more, because just because it's not currently designated as a historic structure does not mean that it doesn't have a historic value to it. So identifying those, and then we just approve the work that comes in. If anyone is going to be making changes or they're doing any kind of alterations, that work will come to us and we review it. And from there we have a number of criteria that we are able to approve it through. And this actually comes through the National Park Service. It's actually at the federal level through the Secretary of the Interior that they come up with these guidelines. And we look at those and make sure that the work that's being proposed and will be performed will meet those guidelines. And that process is a matter of interpretation, because everything is different, and each case comes in with a different, unique issue with it of how to navigate that. And one of the main things is that if it's not doing permanent damage to a building, it's not going to be a huge complication. But what we're trying to make sure of is that the integrity of the building is maintained. You may think that changing out all the windows into brand new energy efficient vinyl windows would be a good move, but actually we're finding that the life of those windows is exponentially shorter than the historic windows. And a lot of people say, well, you need the double panes, but at the same time, if you have a window and a storm window, you have two panes. So a lot of times these old windows can be more energy efficient than the brand new stuff that's coming out today. So there's a number of things that we're trying to prevent from happening that's essentially irreparable. We've seen massive changes on buildings that you just can't really undo. The materials don't exist anymore, like I mentioned earlier. But the main thing is that we're doing right by the building, and also for the future of the building in regards to the past as well. So there's a lot of time scale that we work with on this.
Thanks. So historic districts can include both commercial and residential buildings. What benefit or impact does living in a historic district have for residents?
So this is actually, there's a lot of conversation around the value of the districts. In fact, not long ago, there's a conversation that came up in the context of, is it worth having a designation? Because a lot of people view it as an additional process we put in place just to make things more complicated. But what it's doing actually is improving the value of the area. There are a lot of people who look for not just a historic home, but a historic home within a historic neighborhood. And so the continuity of that can actually raise the values of the home as it is, but also you're really eligible to multiple tax credits. One of the main things that I kind of alluded to earlier is that there's multiple designations. Well, there's the local designation, but then there's we also have the National Register, which is actually at the federal level, and again, that's actually through the parks. It's actually through the National Park Service. So if you have a nationally designated, you're eligible, or you're eligible for all the federal tax credits that come with that, and that is 20% of any of the project costs. And then for the local designation, this actually recently came back that there's a 25% tax credit that's eligible for anyone. So if you have a home that's in a local historic district or on the National Register, you're eligible for a 25% tax credit on the work you're doing to your to the project that you have. So there's a number of more financial benefits, but really, and this is the part that I feel like we might lose people on because it's a little bit more of a high level thought, but the idea of place and what the continuity means in terms of a home built in the 1850s or the 1860s through today and how we guide that along. There are things that people identify as landmarks that has its own kind of designation as well, where you might not even realize what's good about an area until it changes irreparably. So if you remove a building, it can entirely change your drive, your walk, the landscape of the environment. So there's an emotional value to it, and there's a lot that people tie to it. In fact, one of the more recent changes to our skyline has been the Beans Tower, and that was I mean, a lot of people identified that as a marker for home, and it was a historic building from the World War I era, and with that being gone, you just can't really put that back. And there's a lot of things that I think people overlook in terms of what that value actually is. So there's a lot of different ways to define value, but there's financial and emotional and social. There's a lot of different pieces to it.
So if somebody was interested in being a part of the Historic District Commission, do they have that ability? And if so, how do they go about that?
Yep. So I believe the main criteria is you have to live in the city of Saginaw. And the application is through the clerk's office, and it's pretty much like any other board or commission that you would join. We currently have a number of openings. I believe we have 4, maybe 5. So we have lots of room right now. And we are currently the youngest commission like within the city as well, which is actually something that I think is pretty incredible because the conversation around historic buildings tends to be more of an older folks game. And I think we need to be able to have this conversation at a much younger level because of the way that the future and the way that preservation is really looking towards the future. It doesn't just rest in what's happened already. So we need a lot more involvement on the things that we're looking to protect and the kinds of stories we're looking to tell as well. Because there's a very, very large piece of our history that I think is not being told and is not being properly preserved as well. So there's a lot of need for people joining the HDC, but we also have all of our study committees too. And that's another way to join, which is the process of looking at a building, seeing what the historic value is, and going through the whole process to make sure that we can put it under local protection. And that requires research, that requires writing. There's a number of things we can bring to the table on it. But what I'm seeing with what we have currently is there is much more we can do, and that's I think one of the things that's going to be a huge priority for us in the next years to come.
Well, that's a good lead into the next question, which was what is the historic study group, which you just answered. But we do have, you mentioned that that you've had a lot more action or movement in that direction since you've been chair of the HDC. And I think we have 2 buildings under study right now. And if you want to just talk a little bit about that and like how long that process is and how important it is to get those processes started and things like that.
Yeah, so we've been really excited about the more recent the more recent developments that have happened, because a lot of people are beginning to see the value of having a local designation. And it's also a great way to get the conversation going. There are two major buildings that are pretty universally loved. One of them being the Potter Street Station. That is just a phenomenal train depot. And the work that's being done to kind of put together a plan for that essentially coincided with them requesting that we look into creating a historic district out of that building. And in terms of historic value, I mean, it's a no-brainer. That was the place that you arrived at when you visited Saginaw in the late 1800s. It was the first thing you saw, and so just the number of people who came through there is pretty incredible. But also, the guy who designed that train station, actually, through doing the historic district study, we learned that that architect is the same. It's the same architect who did, I believe it was Union Station in Chicago. And it's the last Victorian train station that we have in the country. It's pretty much one of a kind at this point, and it's in a state of disrepair. But I'm no stranger to that. I view a ton of optimism there. I always joke that it's half demolished or half built, kind of like the glass half full conversation, because we already have the shell and we have so many details within these buildings. But to go back to the idea of the research we're doing, we're looking into that building, and then also we are currently looking into the Behringer building, which is another gem that we have. And we're hoping that having a local designation will create a lot more of a conversation. And the way that we share this information as well is something that I'm very interested in exploring more, because it's one thing to do the study and mail it off to Lansing, and then they send it back to us. It goes to council, there's a hearing, there's this whole process that we have in place. But to me, one of the most exciting things is that we're getting a group of people together to look into what is this building? What does it mean to us? And to be able to articulate that a lot better and to do more storytelling related to this. So it's not just an old building, but to really contextualize it and to explain to people what these buildings meant for their time. And also to look to other places as well as our own town, where we can look around and see how old buildings have been reused. And maybe it's not going to be a train depot. Maybe it will be. we need to figure out the logistics of getting passenger rail back to Saginaw, which I'm very hopeful for. But if not that, what else could it be? And it's just incredible to go through a building like the Behringer building too, and to just think about the amount of just raw potential there is. So where a lot of people see a building in disrepair, I see unbelievable potential and a way to just look at taking what was left to us as an inheritance and to keep that process going. But we have, I think, half a dozen other buildings that are lined up right now for keeping it a constant process of always looking into it. And the majority of our districts are on the west side. We have 3 in the downtown area, but we really are lacking on the east side representation there. There's a lot more designation that needs to be done in order to accurately convey what we have.
Another great segue into our next question, and that is, can you tell us how many buildings are in public ownership still?
So in public ownership or the actual districts themselves?
Annie, do you want to clarify for us?
Yeah, specifically like how many historic buildings we have left in general, and then like how many of them are in public ownership, just because, I mean, maybe not in general because there are quite a few, but there aren't too many left that are in public ownership, it was my understanding. So I just wanted you to talk a little bit about that since.
Yeah, so the one of the things about historic buildings that is tricky is the fact that they're pretty much after World War II, there was an era that is referred to mainly as an urban renewal era, where this idea came in that we needed to get rid of the old stuff and to basically build new and to build for the future. And the ideas that were going around at the time, I disagree with the importance of the trade-off there. But really, what we have left is the things that seemingly because of these trends where people don't really see the value of these kinds of buildings, they end up in public ownership for a number of reasons, really. There are many ways that a building can fall into public ownership. The main one is through the tax foreclosure process. And the number of individual structures we have, I know we've got the Jefferson Apartments at the intersection of Millard and Jefferson. The Behringer Building is in public ownership. There are a number on Genesee, including the Mason Building, which is across the street from the Bancroft, and at the intersection of Washington and Genesee. That intersection in particular is the last intact intersection that has all four of its buildings in the whole town. The Mason Building is actually the oldest building in downtown. And that building is one that if you look at any picture of the city of Saginaw, with very few exceptions, the Mason Building is there. And it has a big gray facade on it currently. That's an 1860s building that they remodeled 100 years later. About 90 years later or so, they decided they wanted to change the look of it. So in the 50s, they threw a big facade on it. And that one, I think, is going to be a very important conversation as well. And then as you go down the block, one of the buildings is owned by the land bank over by the police station currently. And then there are, let's see, I think that might be all of the ones in public ownership. I think so. Yeah. So I think those are the ones that we own, but a number of houses, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of houses. That's the big piece of it, where this infrastructure that exists, that as the times changed and people wanted the more modern housing and things like that, and the old houses were just kind of viewed as more of a just an endless money pit. That these kinds of houses have gone or have come into public ownership, but the idea is that nobody really wants the old stuff. And that's where I think we need to be doing a much better job of identifying which ones are important to be able to have those conversations around which ones, when they come into public ownership, we should really make note of what we have. And right now, pretty much everything we have in public ownership are very valuable buildings that we could be doing a lot of things with and driving the conversation more towards the redevelopment of them as opposed to viewing them as the burdensome money pits. The thing about a new structure that I like to remind people is that it's only new for a little bit of time. And then after that, it starts becoming a money pit. It's just an inevitability as time changes and as things go on and as the repairs are needed. But yeah, there's a lot of things that the HDC is going to be involved with as well for the conversation around the ownership of the buildings.
I know you touched on this a little bit already, but could you maybe just expand on where the historic districts are located in the city and maybe some things that are easily identifiable about them?
Yeah, so the biggest one we have is the Old Town District. So the more commercial area, that is actually, I believe it is our largest historic district. And then North Michigan Avenue, that whole strip going up to, I believe, Bliss Park is where it ends. Heritage Square, the whole neighborhood, that area is a historic district, and we also have 3 individual buildings. It can be a whole neighborhood or it can be an individual structure. And the Armory Building, the Jefferson One Building, and also the Temple Theater. Those 3 are the ones on the east side, but in the future we will have the train depot and the Behringer Building as well. So there are the individual buildings, and then more of neighborhoods. And I believe that's all of them. And maybe one of my commissioners will be screaming right now watching it if I'm missing ones.
All right. You may have covered this too, but um, specifically, like, what are the criteria that are used? I know that you said there are different types of designations, but I guess with a local designation, since we have buildings under study, I mean, obviously we know that they're old buildings,
Mhm.
but what is the criteria? And specifically, like, how old does a building have to be to actually qualify as historic?
Mhm. So, really, the rule of thumb is more than 50 years. It can be a historic building. These really, there's a number of things, like I mentioned, that range from the historic value to the cultural value. The ways that we identify certain, places um, as kind of a piece of our identity. And I think that's a way to really think about it, is identifying the things that are important to us as people. Um, that's a conversation that needs to be much wider because um, I've had these conversations in the past with other historians about the fact that a lot of history is the old dead white men, but we have a much, much more diverse history here that we, or we need to be identifying the places and also the neighborhoods in which important things have happened. There are many, many places um, that might just seem very innocuous. In fact, the Cushway home is actually one that I've been really fascinated by. It's the oldest house in the whole county, and it's over by the YMCA, so it's kind of a house that's by itself. It was actually moved there from, I believe, Heritage Square, because it was about to be demolished, and I believe it was actually Tom Mudd who identified it and said that's an important home. And it's very nondescript, and it's a very normal house of its time. But then you think about the context of, if it's the oldest standing structure, that gives it significance. It might not be the most elaborate building in the world, but it's a significant one. I think we should have done a much better job in embracing more things like the birthplace of uh, or like a number of people. I don't think we have the home of Stevie Wonder anymore. I believe that house is gone. But those types of places where we can look at it and see that an important person came from here, or that there's an important thing that happened. And so really the investigation of actually putting it under study is a way of clearing that up and saying, we think this might be significant, or you could look into it and there's really nothing all that remarkable about it. It could be just an architecturally significant building, but it could just be, the childhood friend of the nephew of the former roommate of Jesse Hoyt, like some loose connection or something like that, where we don't necessarily have a person that's actually tied to it. And when we looked into doing more of a historic look into the Beans Tower, that conversation I found to be really interesting, because a number of people said, well, the building's not that interesting looking when you remove the sign from it too. But in terms of what it meant for the agriculture of the area, and the way that when we dried up all the lumber and we cut down all the trees, um, we were left with a bunch of fields of stumps, and they dug up the stumps and they planted beans, and beans became a huge a cash crop for us. So all of those beans went through that building, because we were the hub where 93% of the Navy beans or something like that in the entire country came through that plant. And the significance of that, you begin to weigh, where is where does the value come from for this individual building? It could be a park as well. But looking into the history of it and just kind of diving a little deeper to figure out which things would give it historic value or cultural value. That there are again, a number of criteria, but each one being so different, you can really designate for different things.
Alrighty, I'm going to ask you this last question, and I kind of have a follow-up question of my own. So, what kind of challenges does the HDC face, and how can the public support preservation?
So the HDC is an organization, or is a commission that a lot of people do view as more of a "you can't tell me what to do with my house" kind of situation. And that issue is a very interesting conversation because there's a number of things that go into that, including the fact that the economics of preservation are kind of tough sometimes. If you have a historic asset that's in a low income area, how much are you going to demand of people to say you have to do this exactly, up to snuff, where the person who built it might have been a millionaire? But with the way that the things have changed over time, these homes have become a lot less around here as the attractive asset, but a lot of times the historic buildings can be where people have to be. And the way they chopped up these places into a number of different things, there's a big conversation that I think is missing in the preservation world at large around this not being, the upper middle class, like and beyond game of saying, oh, preservation is just something that everyone should do, and if you don't do it, you don't get it. It's much more beyond that. And I think that one of the things that we're currently focusing on the HDC, we've got 3 objectives. One of them being becoming more of a resource to the city of Saginaw. So if we are going to make these kinds of requirements to say these are the things you have to do, we need to also be helping people out with how to do those things, the education behind it, the resources, the connections, and the contractors. I would love to see more of a connection around the people who are local who can do this kind of work, and being able to coordinate those types of things, because a lot of people just have someone around the house who's handy, who knows how to do these things. And the joy of it for me is learning that kind of stuff and learning that it's not rocket science at the end of the day. Carpentry is a skill for sure, but a lot of it can be done yourself. And the education behind that is one of the things that I think is incumbent on us to be providing those things and to be reaching out more. Another obstacle that we have is the fact that we have a lot of buildings that are just falling apart. We've had multiple buildings fall into the street this year alone. And the way that these things are, there's such a paradox that I see between what the younger people want and what the older people think people want. And so you end up with a bunch of young people who are buying vinyl and, going to thrift stores and buying old clothes. And like there's more of an idea around or like the sustainability of it is a whole thing. In fact, preservationists often say that the greenest building is the one that already exists. But on top of that, there's this big disconnect between thinking anyone will ever want these buildings versus kind of an untapped market of young people who want to move into one and really make something of it. I think I fell in love with it because I grew up in a 1970s house, and now I live in an 1880s house, and it's much more. There's just a totally different feeling to the home, and there's a flow to it that doesn't exist in other houses. And pretty much any house built after the 50s has a TV room where it's completely centered around the TV, and these were built before lights existed. It was candles and coal and things like that. And a lot of them have carriage steps outside from when the horse-drawn carriage would come up to the sidewalk. So the way that there's an interest but these buildings are collapsing is the big chicken egg situation. But again, there's really I'm very much of the opinion that the amount of money that it takes to remove a building is usually comparable to what the current obstacle is. We've seen a number of things come and go in terms of, well, how much is it going to be to preserve it versus how much is it going to be to tear it down? Most of the time, the preservation is the more affordable option. And a lot of people overthink what needs to be done with these too. So it's really, I mean, there are a number of challenges, but I think the biggest ones are understanding where the neighborhoods currently are as opposed to where they were, and being able to bridge the gap to really bring this entire inventory that we have. Pretty much any building you pick in Saginaw is going to be historic because we live in a historic city. And again, just because it doesn't have designation does not mean that it's not historic. So that making it more possible for people to jump in. That momentum is there recently. The tide has been turning, but the preservationists, they got started back in the 60s, I believe. And the HDC's only been around since the 80s. So this conversation around preservation is a relatively young one. But in Europe, it's not at all. It's a much longer picture that they deal with. But for us, 80 to 140 years is a huge deal. We don't have Roman ruins or anything like that, but we do have a lot of really interesting things around here that are the foundation of where this place came from and how it quite literally rose out of a swamp and became a hub and one of the metropolises of the state of Michigan. So it's a very interesting arc that this place has gone through, and it's made up of all of its assets. And that's where I think the HDC is a very important component of all of this, because it's the one extra thing to say, have you considered this part? Have you considered the historic value of it? And yeah, a number of challenges and a number of solutions as well.
Well, you once again answered my little follow-up question within your answer to the previous question. And I was just going to ask you, obviously, as you stated, like the residential historical homes that we have are so important to our dwindling housing stock. And I was going to ask you how we make that preservation possible, which you mentioned a number of ways to help
There's
close that gap.
many more though, because the Lee in particular, which if people don't know what I'm referencing on the Lee, the old house that used to be called the Cat Lady's house, and that's where most people identify it from. But that house was my crash course. I didn't know anything about any of this work. I remember asking the question, what is a land bank, very early on? And it really begins there. And the Lee then was everything from clearing a building out and watching how it gets, totally stabilized, and what goes into repairing windows, how to remove windows, how to, pull up floors, how to refinish floors, how to repair plaster, like all of these things that go into it. All of that education, I think we need, or because I'd mentioned this before, but like providing that kind of education, I think would be huge, because empowering people to be able to do it themselves is the big difference. I've got some friends who they're the reason that I'm involved in any of this, because when you look at the elephant of, a house that's been neglected for over a decade and it's got a hole in the roof that's caused all kinds of havoc, it's really remarkable to be around people who are going, oh, that's no big deal. And it's really funny, because it seems like, are you kidding me? Look at it. It's nuts. But you really start to see how preservationists can be some of the most optimistic people in the world, because the roof will be caving in and the floor is gone, but they'll say, but the woodwork is beautiful. And I love that piece of it. Because it's contagious. It really is contagious when you start seeing that piece of it. And the way that a lot of people say you'll never get your money back for doing it, it becomes a labor of love. And the culture around doing preservation is one that's very inviting in terms of people are always happy to share what they've learned, because most of the time we just want to prevent you from going through the headache of what we spent 3 weeks doing that we could probably tell you it could take a day. So like there's a lot of things that people learn by doing, and that kind of open dialogue and helping one another is a culture that has already existed in Saginaw, where people do help each other out. And I would not be able to do any of the things I'm doing now without the people who just kind of show up and volunteer knowledge. And being able to coordinate that while also having a much more accessible housing stock, to take these houses that we have in public ownership. I mean, there's, I think, 2,300 individual properties on the Land Bank's website, but they have over 5,000. So the ones that we see online might not even be in the inventory. So being able to find those individual projects and find the people who want to take them on, coordinating that into one place, because far too often I hear, where do I even start? What website do I go to? That there's all kinds of questions that people have out of the gate. And so I think the best way for people to get involved in something like this is to just very blindly start doing stuff and to start asking people. And the reason I have the house that I have is because I was at the Savoy one day and said, hey, I'm looking for this. And then the word of mouth, it just led me to a place that was available. So there's just so much to it. I could honestly go on for hours about it, but the main thing that I think is really important for people to know is that it is daunting but very accessible and very possible. And the way that we usually frame something in the lens of, I know that the Lee was quoted at around $800,000 to repair it, and we're almost done, and we're not even at 200,000. So it's a fraction of what people thought it was going to cost. And so how can we, this is my big advocacy lately, has been, if we are willing to demolish a structure, could we also take that money and solve the problems that deter people from taking it on? So if it needs a new roof, let's give it one. If the foundation is bad, let's fix it. If the windows are broken, let's fix those. But looking at it as, how can we give people a head start? I don't think we need to do all the work and rehab the total house and say, here it is for $250,000. But I think that there's a middle ground between that and a house that's caving in for $500. There's a big difference. And if we put ourselves in the middle there, I think we're going to really find that there are people who are willing to do this, and people who do want to roll up their sleeves and do that work. And I couldn't imagine a better neighbor than someone who's, all right, let's do this. Let's jump in and actually do the work. Because there's plenty of it.
Okay, so I have oh, go ahead, Kevin.
Oh, did you have a final question, Annie?
Question and a follow-up comment, but you go first.
Okay, this is just a personal question I gotta ask, because I see a lot of what's probably misinformation on Facebook floating around about it. But could you just clear up for us what happened with the Beans Bunny sign?
Like the actual neon sign?
Yeah.
So I believe that was removed by the school district and put into storage.
The previous owner that was selling it to the school district removed it.
Okay.
And it is currently stored in a safe location. The last I was told that there is a local individual who does that kind of work, who is trying to figure out a way that they can help rehabilitate the sign. I think the biggest struggle is going to be is not really fixing the sign, but finding a location that is, one, high enough, and two, stable enough and strong enough for us to rehang and relight the sign. So, I mean, it is something that definitely has completely changed our skyline. I know, coming back home every summer, that's, what I'd look to when I was a kid was, oh God, thank God we're home. Like we're 5 minutes away from grandma's house. I can see the Beans Tower. And so that is a big deal. So I think the public, if they still care as much as they seem to have at the time, need to get together and find a way to support the group that is overseeing the replacement of the sign. Because I know that's something I hope we don't forget about, and hope it just doesn't, it sits somewhere collecting dust for another couple decades because people lost the ambition around, getting it a new location. But if that's okay, I have one other question for you, Alex. What kind of influence? I'm not sure that I actually even really know the answer to this question. But when we talk about the historic districts and the historic neighborhoods, what influence do you guys have over like infill and new construction? Because we're talking about we have a lack of affordable housing, so there's a lot of movement around trying to work with the land bank to see what we can do to use that housing that they have as affordable options. But there's also talk about, we have these vacant lots. People don't always want an expanded lot. They don't want to maintain more yard. Maybe they want a small home or a tiny home. And I think those things are great. And I think we have to have, a wide variety of housing options that are affordable for people, because not everybody wants the same thing or needs the same thing. But what influence does the historic district, like if we're looking at a lot and we're going to build a small home in the historic district commission on a lot, do you guys have any say or influence over, at least on the outside, trying to make sure that it matches? Or I can think of some new builds along Michigan Avenue, maybe, that or not new now, but were new at the time and were hideous and not at all in keeping with the historic nature of the neighborhood. And I know when it comes to a city council, when we're dealing with developers, we're very limited on what kind of constraints we can put on people. One, because we want people to come here and develop, and two, because it's their money and it's their decision sometimes, and we can't overstep as the government. But do you guys have any influence over those types of things?
Yeah, so if it's in a neighborhood that is a district, it wouldn't apply if it was next to just an individual building, because the historic value at that point would be the building and not necessarily the neighborhood. But if it's in a neighborhood, like if it was in Old Town, or if it was in Heritage Square, that it would have to come through the HDC, because of how what's going up would then be affecting the character of the neighborhood. So the it would have to be complementary to what's around it. And there are also things too, like trees and also the roads. Those things are actually under HDC purview as well, because some of those trees might be older than the house itself, and the roads, a lot of the brick roads that we have in Old Town, and there's a couple too on the east side as well, but the brick roads are actually incredibly significant, because one of our main industries was actually the paving bricks, and we had a number of organizations around here that were creating those bricks. And so the brick itself has value, and in fact that's another thing that people identify with as well, is the brick that just says Saginaw on it. So it would, and I know that there is a project that's going to be coming to Old Town where we looked over to make sure that what was replacing a building would match and also be consistent with what's around it, because that really is the most important piece, is the context. And I do think, though, that there is merit to brand new being right next to the old, and that was one of my favorite things about Chicago when I lived there, was that the neighborhoods that I would walk around would have all of these houses, and it would be everything from the 20s to the 1800s to built this year, and they'd be glass and metal and all of those things. But the beauty really is the combination and being able to see the full arc, and to have the new construction with the old buildings. It really isn't one or the other. We don't want it to be all or nothing. So it's about having a diversity there, but also respecting what has been there for generations and generations and generations. And one of the things I like to remind people as well is that the way we used to make buildings, and this isn't necessarily that applicable anymore, with a few exceptions, but newer construction tends to be single use. So if you're building a KFC, you're going to build a KFC or a Pizza Hut, you know, like those are very identifiable buildings as that, you know, that brand or that franchise. But what they used to do, and this is one of the things I love about the historic nature, is that it's endlessly recyclable. It's just a big rectangle and it's a big open space. And so these things can be anything from a yoga studio to a restaurant to a brewery or whatever it is that people come up with for that space. It's just a blank slate. And so it's not necessarily that new is bad for the sake of being new. It's just that the trends and the things that we do and the use that we're looking to build for is a lot more confined to what it's being built for. So it's almost a disposable kind of structure. So I think that would be the main influence as well around around a building in or like within a historic district, how that would apply. But we also aren't going to yeah, I think that's the core of it.
Well, thank you. I did want to mention, since you had we've talked about publicly owned buildings, and we've mentioned the land bank and how what is a land bank was one of the first questions that you found yourself trying to figure out when you first got started doing all of these things. And I just thought it would be a good opportunity to mention, because Cece and myself and Alex are now part of a work group that is assembled between some like-minded people and some not necessarily like-minded people, but just a diverse group of people who are going to be working directly with the land bank manager. Alex talked about things, kind of the tide turning and things moving in a different direction and the different type of momentum that's there between, or towards thinking about these things before they're falling apart, and identifying these projects is important before before we're faced with losing them. And so I'm enthusiastic. We just got confirmation that meeting is finally scheduled, and we'll be meeting next month with them. And I'm excited about the different work that we'll be able to do, and just the responses we've gotten from the land bank so far. I mean, I haven't gotten everything I wanted by any means, but I think there's reason to be cautiously optimistic with like the direction we're moving in, or at least I'm cautiously optimistic. So I just really appreciate Alex and all the work that he does, especially for the Historic District Commission. I want to remind anybody watching that you can apply at the clerk's office to serve on the HDC. How many seats do you have left available?
I think it's 5. I want to say 5 off the top of my head.
5 left, or 5
Yes.
total on the commission?
Remaining.
Okay. So, and those seats aren't specific to anybody in neighborhood. Cece could join, as long as she meets the requirements, or are those specific to the different historic areas?
There have been some recent changes on those rules, so I actually wouldn't want to speak to that off the top of my head, but there are a couple things we're looking for. If there's an architect at all in the area, or a person who's very knowledgeable in architecture, that's one of the things we could really use as well. Yeah, just the level of commitment of that's actually another thing I wanted to mention as well is that we meet once a month, but there are a number of other ways that you can stay busy. In fact, there's a bunch of projects we've talked about in the past that if you want to get creative with us, then now would actually be the perfect time to jump in, because there's a number of initiatives that I want to jump into.
Anybody can serve on the study group, and you apply the same way through the clerk's office, but there's no restriction on your residency. Because I think you're right. I'm not sure those rules were changed so recently. They might currently be laid over for consideration. I have to go back and look.
I'm not even sure if they've been voted on yet.
I honestly think, because they had to go to zoning, so I think it might actually be one of the ones that we laid over at the last meeting, so it might not be final yet. But see, that just goes to show you how active these things are, and what forward motion and momentum there are, is that we're working all the time. But the important thing is that we get people to serve on the Historic District Commission. So we always have a quorum. And that because a building can fall apart in the time it takes to complete a historic district study. You can identify a building a year out, you think it's okay, but if you don't have a drone flying over the roof, you don't know that there is a water bottle caught in a spigot and it's making water pool up on your roof, or you don't know that there's a trap door open on a building and water is just coming in through the top because you don't have eyes on it from the ground. So it's really important that we have people who are, mindful of these things, and maybe they can't serve on the HDC because of where they live, or maybe hopefully the idea is that it's full and that we have, a group of people, excuse me, buddy, that we have, available to sign up and serve on the historic district, the study committees, because we can't get any of that stuff done without. The good news is that in working with the land bank manager, one of the things he has expressed to us is that if we provide him a list of important buildings, whether they're under study or not, if they're theirs, that they will, keep that in mind and make sure that it doesn't need the historic district, designation if we identify it from our standpoint as important. If the HDC chair says we're going to study this here in the future, but this one's important, we're not there yet. That they seem to have a willingness to keep that kind of information in mind when they're making their decisions. So if anybody else has anything else they want to add or ask, go right ahead. If not, I appreciate you all so much, and we can all talk soon, very soon.